And first we have Professor Paul Copan, who's a professor of philosophy and ethics from Palm Beach Atlantic University, Florida. He's the author and editor of many books on philosophy of religion, and theological ethics. His books include Is God a Moral Monster from 2011, edited Routledge Companion to Philosophy of Religion, and also he's the editor of The Rationality of Theism, which is just a few of his books. And he has two books coming out. One little book called A Little Book for New Philosophers, and also A Dictionary of Christianity and Science. He's well known for giving talks all around the world, and we're really happy that he's with us here today, here in Helsinki. And the second speaker today is Professor Sami Pihlström. He's the Professor of Philosophy of Religion here in Helsinki, just started here actually, and we're very glad to have Sami here today. He has published extensively on pragmatism and philosophy of religion in English and Finnish. Any other languages? Just English and Finnish, okay. His books include Pragmatist Metaphysics from 2009, Pragmatic Pluralism and the Problem of God from 2013, and especially relevant for our current discussion is his latest book, Taking Evil Seriously. And he has a new upcoming book on the problem of evil called Kantian Anti-Theodicism, which is supposed to be out by the end of the year. Okay, good. So what we'll have here is somewhat informal, not really a debate, but Professor Copan will go first, and then Sami afterwards. Then we'll exchange some comments, and then we'll open it up to questions. And we'll hope to conclude the talk, the whole thing, by 5:45, and I'll make sure of that. And I hope that you have good questions to ask, and looking forward to an extremely interesting and stimulating discussion. But without any further ado, let us welcome Professor Paul Copan.
I'm very glad to be with you here in Finland. My mother is from just down the coast. She's from Riga, Latvia, so another Baltic country. And my father's from Ukraine, so it's very good to be back home in this region. I've been to Europe a number of times, and it's always a pleasure to come back. Be warmly welcomed by the Finns, so thank you very much. Thank you for the organizers, Danielle and Apu for moderating, and Sami, I'm very glad to be participating in this conversation with you. In talking about the problem of evil, I'll make sure that we're on screen here. There we go. All right, good. Well, these pictures tell a lot, and they remind us that all is not well in the world. The problem of evil, the problem of pain, the problem of suffering. In my talk, I want to look at 4 points. And I want to discuss, first of all, about the reality of evil, that we observe it as something very readily at hand. And then, what about establishing a definition of evil? What does evil mean? And then, discerning a worldview context for evil. Which worldview makes the most sense of evil? And we'll look in particular at two leading contenders, theism and naturalism, and then finding hope in an evil world. So with that, I begin by talking first of all about the reality of evil, that we observe it. And we observe it in the world around us, as well as within each one of us. We could talk about the evil around us, but perhaps a little more reluctant to talk about the evil within each one of us. We easily see evil around us. We think of terrorism. We think of genocide in Rwanda. We think of concentration camps. Marilyn McCord Adams, a Christian philosopher, she talks about these paradigmatic horrors, these standard or classic cases of evil. And she lists a number of them. I'm just giving you a sampling of them. A rape of a woman and axing off her arms. Psychophysical torture, whose ultimate goal is the disintegration of personality. Betrayal of one's deepest loyalties. Cannibalizing one's own offspring. child pornography, parental incest, slow death by starvation, participation in Nazi death camps, having to choose which of one's children will live and which will be executed by terrorists. And Marilyn Adams says that when people engage in these sorts of acts, they have justification for doubting the positive meaning to their lives, because this so undermines our very humanity. Then there's something a little closer to home for my own family, the Holodomor, the hunger plague in the Ukraine in 1932 and 33. 6 million is a gross underestimate of those who perished in this Soviet famine. But my father, who died recently, an artist, poet, you see some of his paintings there. He was born in Petropol, Ukraine, a small village, and he himself, there are a few family pictures there, dear, joyful man, and there's a painting that he made of his own home in the Ukraine, and he went through the throes of communism, where his father's family would be evicted from their farmhouse in the middle of winter. It was confiscated by these communist radicals. And then my paternal grandfather, Andrei, was arrested, placed into a labor camp, and would eventually die of starvation the following year. And my father eventually made his way to Germany, but through digging trenches for the Nazis who recruited him, or kind of forced him into working, so pulling dead bodies and wounded soldiers into the trenches. And he would be separated from his relatives for most of his life. So it was a time of great pain, of great sorrow. He bore much sorrow in his heart throughout his life. But that's the evil outside. There's also evil within us. And I think the more self-scrutinizing we are, the more we will see the inconsistencies, with the demanding of people living up to our expectations, but when people have the same expectation of us, we want them to take it easy on us. And so it's very easy to live this kind of inconsistency. But C.S. Lewis, when he examined himself for the first time, he said that he found what appalled him: a zoo of lusts, a bedlam of ambitions, a nursery of fears, a harem of fondled hatreds. And he said, "My name was Legion," a picture of many demons within. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, we're familiar with his work, former, he had been a Soviet dissident, was imprisoned in the Soviet Gulag system. He says, as he reflected on his experience, he says, "Gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. This line shifts. Inside us it oscillates with the years. Even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. And even in the best of all hearts, there remains an unuprooted small corner of evil." This is someone who has looked at evil in the face. Another one, Elie Wiesel, who reflected on the human condition. He wrote, "Deep down, man is not only an executioner, not only a victim, not only a spectator, he is all three at once." So again, if we have any self-awareness, we will detect there is something wrong not only outside of us, but also within us, that we are not what we ought to be. We fall short of the ideal. The Canadian artist Douglas Copeland, he speaks about his own inadequacy, said, "I no longer seem to be capable of giving. I no longer seem capable of kindness. I seem being beyond able to love." A heart's cry that he recognizes how far short he falls. Well, let's talk about evil. We talk about suffering and evil and so forth, and we're kind of clustering around the same ideas. But as we look at the topic of evil, it's important for us to understand what we mean. We've seen examples of the evils, and I'm not going to go through this here. We readily recognize there are different types of evils that exist. But we also have, a lot of people will appeal to science in trying to figure things out. Actually, science doesn't help us when it comes to discovering evil or analyzing evil. For example, on what basis can we say that a person ought to act in a certain way? Science talks about description. It doesn't talk about prescription or ought. When we look at someone like Hitler, we can describe Hitler's background, his anger and so forth, but science can't prescribe what he ought to have done. And furthermore, we have to ask the question, how can the reality of evil, moral value, human dignity, moral duties and ideals be proven scientifically? That's just not the domain of science. And if we're clinging to science, well, we will be very frustrated because science just doesn't cover that territory. We need to move into something else. And atheists, we know, have used the problem of evil as their chief argument against the existence of a good God. But again, we need to consider, what do we mean by evil? Many atheists assume the reality of evil, but without trying to define it often. But when we try to define it, we can better see that real evil presupposes a standard from which it deviates. C.S. Lewis, as an atheist, wrote, he says, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust?" He looked at evil and he thought that, well, there must be some sort of standard by which to judge something as evil. Evil is a deficiency, a corruption, a departure from the way things ought to be. So when we look at the example of Stalin or Hitler, we can say by their mass murder programs that they departed from what they ought to have done. Evil could be perhaps compared to this mundane example of a pothole, that it presupposes that something is missing that ought to be there. Or perhaps like counterfeit money, it's a deviation, a departure from a standard, a design plan. So here we're saying that evil is a departure from the way things ought to be. This is a kind of a minimum. When people use the argument from evil, they're presupposing that things ought to be different than the way that they are. But this seems to suggest a kind of blueprint, a kind of design plan, a kind of objective standard. But here the atheist or the skeptic has two problems: the problem of evil and the problem of goodness, or this blueprint, or this design plan. We'll come back to this, but let me just move on to my third point. We need to discern which worldview context for evil makes the best sense. And I would say in the academy today, the leading contenders are naturalism and theism. So let's briefly unpack what these are and how they have a bearing on the problem of evil. Now, remember this, every worldview has to deal with the problem of evil. It's not as though it's just a Christian problem or a theist problem. Everyone has to come to terms with evil. And the question is, which worldview does the best job of making sense of evil? And I would argue that naturalism or impersonal views of reality will not succeed in doing so, and that theism is much better equipped to do so. So let's first talk about naturalism. What is naturalism? Well, Carl Sagan, the astronomer, said that the cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. This is kind of a succinct definition, but there's more to it. There's more to unpack here. And there's general agreement that there are three features to naturalism. The first has to do with the nature of reality, or metaphysics. According to the kind of the main naturalist thinking, matter is all that exists. Materialism, no souls, no gods or God, no afterlife, and I would argue no intrinsic dignity is possible here, according to many of the leading naturalists, like Daniel Dennett and so forth. Also, when we talk about causes or causation, etiology, all events are physically determined by prior physical events going all the way back to the Big Bang, known as determinism. So no free will or miracles, and I would argue it's difficult to account for rationality if we're simply the products of blind, deterministic, materialistic forces over which we have no control, that are, in a sense, pumped into our brain, if you will. And then there's knowledge, that in studying epistemology, for the person who is engaging in naturalism, science is the best, or usually stated the only way of coming to know. So this is called scientism. Let me give an example of materialism. And I can list many thinkers. This is Kai Nielsen, who says naturalism denies that there are any spiritual or supernatural realities. It is the view that anything that exists is ultimately composed of physical components. Determinism. Daniel Dennett is on the board of naturalism.org, and it says, from a naturalistic perspective, human beings act the way they do because of the various influences that shape them, whether these be biological or social, genetic or environmental. This means we do not have what many people think of as free will. According to the naturalist, you did not come here of your own free will. There are all sorts of factors that contributed to your coming here, but you did not actually choose. It was not up to you to come. All these forces have a bearing on this, and so you did not freely come here. Richard Dawkins, a noted atheist, talks about scientific beliefs that are supported by evidence, and they get results and so forth. Richard Lewontin, a biologist at Harvard, that he talks about the social and intellectual apparatus science is the only begetter of truth, the only way that we can find truth. John Searle, a noted philosopher at UC Berkeley, says there's exactly one overriding question in contemporary philosophy. How do we fit in? How can we square the self-conception of ourselves as mindful, meaning-creating, free, rational, etc. agents with a universe that consists entirely of mindless, meaningless, unfree, non-rational, brute, physical particles? Michael Martin, the late Michael Martin, I did my dissertation on Michael Martin, he said there is no cosmic purpose if there is no God. And he says we can give our lives purpose by how we conduct them and what we do and how we treat each other and so forth. Well, that also presupposes a certain kind of human nature and what makes for human flourishing and so forth. But here's what Jaegwon Kim, a noted philosopher of mind, says. He says that naturalism is imperialistic. It demands full coverage and exacts a terribly high ontological or metaphysical price. In other words, if you're going to become a naturalist, you have to think hard about this because you are basically going to be undermining a lot of the things that you take for granted about who we are as human beings, about intrinsic dignity, about free will, about having real choices and so forth. Naturalism doesn't let you get away with these sorts of things. You're going to be stripped down to determinism, to materialism, and so forth. But theism, here's my breath of fresh air. Theism doesn't require having to pay this higher price by sacrificing our own humanity, dignity, and purpose. You see, if there is a God, then there is a cosmic purpose. And then we can live our lives and they can have meaning in relation to this God. But if there is no cosmic purpose, then it seems the purpose we have is what we give to it, that it's merely invented and arbitrary. Hitler had made up his own purpose. Stalin made up his own purpose. Who are we to say that anyone's purpose is better than another's? What then is theism? Basically two summary points here. That first of all, a personal God exists. That he's personal, he's intrinsically good, very powerful, intelligent, and self-existent. And also that this God creates a world distinct from himself and creates human beings in the divine image, that is, with dignity and worth. I would argue that theism offers us a simpler, more unifying explanation for a range of features in the world than any human experience. A couple of times as I've been speaking here in Finland, and someone in Tampere was saying that God is too simple an explanation. And I said, isn't it interesting that scientists look for the simpler explanation, that this is the explanation that actually... Am I doing something here? Let's try it again. When people are looking for explanations in science, the simpler the better. That which does the best job of covering the territory is adequate. You're looking for an elegant or a beautiful, a simpler explanation than ad hoc or additional hypotheses clustered together. But when it comes to God, why do we say, oh no, that God is too simple, we've got to come up with something more complex? Well, it seems like a double standard is operating here. What then is the context of theism, and why is it more natural than naturalism itself? See, theism is actually more natural. The universe came to existence a finite time ago from a powerful source distinct from a physical universe, what we call the Big Bang. You see, being cannot come into existence from non-being. Unless you believe that something can pop into existence uncaused out of nothing, something had to be there. Also, the universe is biofriendly. It is life-permitting. It is life-producing. It is life-sustaining. So in order to, I'm not opposed to evolution at all. I think it can be nicely dovetailed with belief in God, that God utilizes the evolutionary process to bring about his purpose. But if you're talking about a mindless universe that somehow produces life, permits life, produces life, and sustains life, that's quite a tall order. Theism has no trouble with this sort of a scenario. It becomes much more, it's a thin reed to lean on if you're a naturalist or an atheist. What about rationality? Does it come from a rational being or non-rational materialistic forces? Or consciousness, from a conscious being or non-conscious matter? Or does beauty come from a creative, intelligent being rather than deterministic, mindless processes? It seems so. Free will, moral responsibility makes better sense coming from a free personal being than deterministic materialistic processes, and also intrinsic human dignity and value coming from a valuable being rather than valueless material processes. I think theism has a lot going for it here. And this is indeed what C.S. Lewis said. He became a Christian out of atheism, and he said, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Things fit together. Things made sense once he became a Christian. And then the philosopher Alan Plantinga says theism offers suggestions for answers to a wide range of otherwise intractable or stubborn questions. And C.S. Lewis, remember, he talked about seeing, he says, how did I got this idea of just and unjust when I looked at the evil world? He says, a man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole world was, the whole of reality was senseless, I found that I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Alan Plantinga asked the question, could there really be any such a thing as horrifying wickedness if naturalism were true? I don't see how. A naturalistic way of looking at the world, so it seems to me, has no place for genuine moral obligation of any sort. So all the more, then it has no place for such a category as horrifying wickedness. There can be such a thing there can be no such thing as how we're supposed to live or obliged to live. So naturalism can accommodate foolishness or irrationality, acting contrary to what are or what you take to be your own interests. But it can't accommodate appalling wickedness, like the things that I listed that Marilyn Adams gave. But if you allow for genuine evil, then you do have actually a very powerful theistic argument if theism and naturalism are your only two options. Seems like we get a lot of feedback here. Okay, we'll try that a little better. Okay. Now, the critic might argue, I get 30 seconds there. The critic might argue, well, if God exists, he would not allow any utterly pointless evil. And probably there is pointless evil, and probably, therefore, God does not exist. But I think what we can talk about is actually, if there is a God who exists, then he wouldn't allow any pointless evil. Well, God does exist, but there is a good case that can be made for God's existence. And therefore, there will not be utterly pointless evil, even if we don't know what the point of that evil it is. That's not our department. We're not in the God department to know what the purpose of this or that evil is. So how then do we find hope in the evil world? Well, if we're convinced that humans have dignity and worth and duties and that real evil exists and that we have free will and moral responsibility, then these point us in a theistic direction. So you see, evil then turns out to be an argument for God's existence in all of this. That if objective moral values exist, then God most likely exists. Well, evil, a negative moral value exists. And therefore, God, the standard, most likely exists. So, if evil is a reality and a good, powerful, wise God exists, then it makes sense to look to this being as the source of hope, so that evil will not have the last word. What if our longing for that happy ending that characterizes all of our fairy tales coincides with a God who has actually done something about evil? You see, the problem of evil actually makes better sense in a theistic world than a naturalistic one, because evil is a departure from the way things ought to be. You see, if you're an atheist, there will be no cosmic justice. People will get away with injustices, with murder, like Mao Zedong and Pol Pot. But maybe this God, the standard of goodness, has stepped in to do something about it. Now, I can talk about the evidence for the bodily resurrection of Jesus and so forth as a historical fact. I've done 3 books on that. I can't get into this now, but I would point to Jesus as the answer to that question. Well, if there is evil in the world, and if there is good reason for a God to exist, and I think there is, then maybe he's actually done something about it. And I'd argue that yes, he has. That God steps into the world in the person of Jesus Christ, that he dies naked on a cross, becomes weak, forgiving those who hate him and oppose him. And if that transforms you, Tim Keller, this author, says, then this can produce in us a remarkable transformation of mindset that begins to permeate the existence of not only our lives, but also those around us. Alan Planeta says that as the Christian sees things, God doesn't stand idly by. He is observing the suffering of creatures. He enters into and shares our suffering. He endures the anguish of seeing his Son, the second person of the Trinity, consigned to the bitterly cruel and shameful death of the cross. Some theologians claim that God cannot suffer. I believe they are wrong. God's capacity for suffering, I believe, is proportional to his greatness. A.N. Wilson, an author who was once critical of Christian faith, as an atheist, wrote a book against Jesus. But he observed, watching, he said, a whole cluster of friends, and my own mother died over a short space of time, convinced me that purely materialist explanations for our mysterious human existence simply won't do on an intellectual level. Becoming a Christian. I could talk about Brian Stewart, who talks, Canadian, who had been an atheist, but the more he covered the world around him and went to all of the terrible places, saw all the evils in the world, he said that the Christians were at the forefront. They were the ones who were there when nobody else was there, offering, sacrificing their lives, doing things that they didn't care about publicity. But he said that they were a faithful witness to the truth, sometimes the only light there. And so he says, I came to this admiring view slowly and reluctantly at the start of my career. I largely abandoned religion, for I too regarded the church as a rather tiresome irrelevance. What ultimately persuaded me, and it took a lot of persuading, was the reality of Christianity's mission, physically and in spirit, before my eyes. Here he sees Christians actually addressing the evil in the world around them because a God has stepped into the world to address evil in the world in the first place. And so he basically says that he came to faith in all of those hellholes of the world where he saw Christians in action. Douglas Copeland, I'll give you the full quotation. He says, my secret is that I need God, that I am sick, to no longer make it alone. I need God to help me give because I no longer seem to be capable of giving. To help me be kind as I no longer seem capable of kindness. To help me love as I seem beyond being able to love. Here he recognized that not only the outer, but also the inner element of evil needed to be addressed. In the midst of war, my own father, he saw death and suffering, but he discovered hope in a God during the Second World War, a God who suffers with humanity, who shows his love by stepping into an evil and unjust world, and who reminds us that all will be made right in the end. It's a good question for us. What presents a better hope for finding meaning in suffering? Is it a worldview with cosmic purpose, or a worldview without a cosmic purpose? Is it a worldview anchored in moral value, rationality, free will, intelligence, consciousness, and so forth, the being of God? Or a worldview anchored in valueless, non-rational, deterministic, unguided, unconscious, materialistic processes? A world with a personal God who steps into this world to suffer with and redeem creatures? Or an impersonal cosmos, or a DNA that neither knows nor cares, as Richard Dawkins says? A world of cosmic justice in which God guarantees everything will be set right, with justice done and wrongs righted? Or a world that people will get away with murder and that virtue goes unrecognized? If there is a good God who exists, maybe he has stepped into this world of evil and of suffering in order to do something about it. Thanks very much for listening.
Can you hear me back there?
Yes.
Okay, good. So thank you so much, Paul, for this really rich talk. It was also rich in pictures, unlike mine. Because I have a sort of traditional philosophers work one with just words. So I'm grateful to you that you already showed all the pictures. But I'm not going to show it. So, all right, let's move on. We should first note that the problem of evil and suffering can be discussed and has been discussed in at least two clearly different ways in academic and scholarly literature. There is, of course, the sort of traditional theological problem in philosophy of religion and theology. How could an omnipotent, omniscient, absolutely benevolent God allow the existence of evil and suffering, or how could such a God have created a world in which there is evil on the scale that we know it to be there? So that's, of course, a traditional issue. But then, in addition, there is also something we might call the problem of evil in secular ethics and political philosophy. How can evil actions and people, if we can talk about evil people as well as evil actions, be explained and understood? Is the concept of evil useful, or is it still a useful concept when we have sort of abandoned the traditional religious responses to these issues? So just by way of introduction, I want to note that there is this sort of division of labor in a way between these two discourses on evil. There is a lot of literature still focusing on the traditional theological issue of theodicy, and I'm going to go into that problem in a moment. But then there is also a largely secular literature on evil that doesn't really focus on the question of God at all. And I think both of these discourses on evil raise interesting philosophical issues, and specifically I want to emphasize in this talk that they raise issues of recognition or acknowledgement. This is largely a matter of how we recognize the reality of suffering and the reality of evil around us, and indeed within us. That was a very important point to emphasize in Paul's talk. It seems that there is some problem with this if I will touch this. It's very sensitive. So, at least implicitly, the issue of recognition or acknowledgement will be involved in this brief discussion. Then let's make some other important conceptual distinctions. Of course, there's a distinction between natural and moral evil. We know that not all evil is humanly caused. There are natural catastrophes. The classical case is the Lisbon earthquake in 1755, which caused a lot of debate among philosophers and intellectuals at that time. And of course, the paradigm case of moral evil is the Holocaust. Then, as I already noted, there is this distinction between approaches that take religion or theology seriously in this area and those approaches that do not. So that is an important distinction. But then perhaps most importantly for the purposes of this talk, there is a distinction between what I call theodicism and anti-theodicism. And here it's a question about whether theodicy is needed. As you know, theodicy means something like justifying or giving reasons for excusing God or God's actions or God's having created a world in which there is evil and suffering. And here the question is whether theodicies are needed or possible, and whether evil or related phenomena such as unnecessary suffering have any purpose, meaning, function, legitimations, justification, or anything along those lines. And perhaps the key point that I want to emphasize in this talk is that I find the opposition between theodicism and anti-theodicism the sort of most fundamental opposition here. I think it's more fundamental than, for instance, the one between religious and non-religious approaches to the problem of evil. Indeed, I think it is more fundamental than the clash between the different worldviews that Paul was talking about. I think theodicism and anti-theodicism opposition is more important than the one between naturalism and theism. So my purpose here is not to defend either theism or naturalism or anything else. I'm not defending any particular worldview. What I am suggesting is that no matter what sort of overall worldview or philosophical metaphysics or whatever we are inclined to subscribe to, we should be anti-theodicists about evil and suffering. We should reject theodicies. So that is sort of my basic view here. Of course, I won't be able to argue thoroughly for this decision here, but I've tried to work on this issue in some recent writings, so I'll be happy to give you further references if you're interested in this. So this issue is pretty much about what you might call the moral appropriateness of philosophical and theological discourses on evil and suffering. It's about how we should speak and philosophically or theologically theorize about evil and suffering in order to adequately appreciate the victims of moral evil and suffering, or evil and suffering in general. For instance, acknowledging their integrity, dignity, status as persons, and so on. I'm trying to analyze theodicies as failures of acknowledgement of a certain kind, and I'll try to explain in a moment what I mean by this. One more sort of conceptual issue, or a couple more. There are, in my view, also secular theodicies. So if you are a theodicist, that doesn't mean that you would have to be a theist. There are also all kinds of non-religious views according to which evil and suffering have a purpose or a function. This might be based on some sort of a teleological view of history, for instance, some sort of Hegelian or Marxist, communist for that matter, views on history. Stalinist the famine caused by Stalin and the Soviet Union in Ukraine would be a horrible example of the way of thinking associated with Marxism and communism, that the sort of overall purpose in a way justifies whatever horrible actions would be taken. So that's of course an extreme case. But then obviously in a much more everyday sense, there are all kinds of ways of excusing or justifying evil and suffering by referring to some overall purpose which that suffering serves. When I'm talking about theodicism, I want that to be understood in a broad sense, covering any view, whether religious or non-religious, that seeks a justification or legitimation for evil and suffering, or suggests that evil or suffering is meaningful within some more comprehensive world picture, within some sort of picture of the overall good to which it aims, or something along those lines, or, and this is also important, maintains that theism ought to find such a justification. So I think also the standard atheist who starts from the argument of evil, arguing for atheism on the basis of the reality of evil and suffering, is also a theodicist in this sense. So in my view, theodicism is a normative meta-level view prescribing a certain way of entering into the argumentative dialogue in this context. And I think this is what we should reject. This is precisely the wrong way to go in this discussion. And if I had more time, I would, for instance, here refer to some, for instance, Wittgensteinian philosophers of religion whose anti-theodicist ideas are based on the idea that it's actually the only both ethically and religiously honest and genuine approach to start from an anti-theodicist perspective, refusing to even enter into the argumentative game of referring to the reality of evil and suffering in an argumentative exchange for and against theism, or theism, or atheism. And all of these issues can be further analyzed in terms of this idea of failing to recognize or acknowledge the victim of evil and suffering. Right. I want to refer to one particularly important historical source here. I think a kind of a crucial turning point in the philosophical literature on evil was Immanuel Kant's work, and especially Kant's so-called theodicy essay from 1791, Über das Missling in alle philosophischen Versuche in der Theodizee, or on the miscarriage of all philosophical trials in theodicy, don't worry about the bibliographical references here. so that's an important piece in which Kant criticizes all earlier, or actually from his point of view, all possible theodicies that are sort of rationalizing, speculative, theoretical, aiming to theoretically justify or excuse the reality of evil and suffering. And in a way, this is part of Kant's general critique of reason. As you may remember in the first critique, the critique of pure reason, in the introduction, Kant says he has had to restrict the scope of knowledge in order to make room for faith. And theodicies justifying evil are, in Kant's view, precisely attempts to know something about God's possible reasons for allowing evil, which lies in an area where we can have no knowledge whatsoever. So the entire theodicy project from the Kantian point of view is entirely misguided all the way from the beginning. And so, of course, are from Kant's point of view all attempts to prove the existence of God. Kant was a theist, he did believe in God, but he rejected absolutely every attempt to prove God's existence. I can't go into any details about Kant's philosophy here, but I think this is the sort of crucial turning point in the history of philosophical literature on evil and suffering. And the Kantian idea here is then that evil and suffering ought to be discussed from the point of view of practical reason and ethics rather than theoretical speculative reason. And it's rather interesting that toward the end of Kant's theodicy essay, he refers to the Bible, which is unusual in his writings, and particularly to the book of Job, which of course is an ancient classic in the attempts to deal with evil and suffering. Kant says that we find an authentic theodicy in the book of Job. So what he's saying is that all these sort of philosophical, rationalizing, speculative theodicies are inauthentic, they are somehow dishonest, they fail to, these are not his words, but they in a way fail to take seriously the suffering they try to legitimize, but we should turn to the book of Job in order to find an authentic response. And I would argue that this is actually an anti-theodicy rather than any theodicy at all. Now, when Kant discusses the figure of Job in the book of Job, he does not focus on the sort of perhaps the traditionally most strongly emphasized virtue of Job's character in the Christian tradition. I mean, especially in the Christian tradition, it has been typical to focus on Job's patience in suffering. Job suffers horribly, but he never sort of rejects God or never, he just stands through the suffering patiently. But Kant's focus is on another key virtue of Job's character, namely his sincerity, or Aufrichtigkeit, as the German word goes, and also a related virtue, truthfulness, Wahrhaftigkeit. And these establish the preeminence of the honest man over the religious flatterer in the divine verdict. These are his words, Kant's words. And then he specifically compares the character of Job to the three friends that come to comfort Job in his suffering. And this is what Kant says. Job speaks as he thinks, and with the courage with which he, as well as every human being in his position, can well afford. His friends, on the contrary, speak as if they were being secretly listened to by the Mighty One, over whose cause they are passing judgment, and as if gaining his favor through their judgment were closer to their heart than the truth. Their malice in pretending to assert things into which they yet must admit they have no insight, and in simulating a conviction which they in fact do not have, contrasts with Job's frankness. So what the friends are doing in the book, of course, is that they are trying to explain why God allows Job to suffer. According to the friends, Job must have sinned. He might not remember what he did. He might not understand the reasons for his suffering himself. for some reason God lets him suffer nevertheless. But Job stands firm in his denial of this. He sincerely believes he did not sin, and there is no way of understanding or conceptualizing his suffering as any sort of punishment for his sins, or any sort of justifiable effect of whatever happened in the past. He just refuses to accept any of that. And this refusal, which is sort of based on his sincerity, is, according to Kant, his key word. So what remains through Job's encounter with God is, from Kant's point of view, Job's honesty and his faith on morality, rather than any morality on faith. So of course Kant would reject entirely the view that it's only on the basis of a religious worldview that we can have any moral values or any moral respect for the dignity of the human person. Morality is absolutely binding anyway, no matter whether there are any religious background reasons for that. It's completely irrelevant. But then morality can lead us to a religious worldview, according to Kant, and religion can be based on morality, but not the other way around. Now, of course, there is a slight anachronism in the way in which Job seems to be turned into a Kantian moral thinker in Kant's essay. That's in a way slightly strange, but the important point is that Kant represents Job's claims as exemplifications of the moral vices of rationalizing theodicies. There is a certain kind of insincerity and dishonesty from the Kantian point of view in the theodicist project, all the way from the beginning. So Kant even goes almost as far as to say that theodicies are evil. He doesn't say that in so many words, but he does say that our tendency to distort even inner declarations before our own conscience, our tendency not to admit even to ourselves what we sort of sincerely think, that is in itself evil, even if it harms no one. So what Kant is advocating here is of course not only sincerity and honesty in general, but in particular honesty in the face of oneself, and like internal honesty, being true to oneself. And there is in contrast to that, there is a certain kind of pretense in theodicies, according to the exemplified by the phrase. So in this sense, I think we could bring this into contact with some 20th century discussions of the problem of evil. We could, from the Kantian point of view, even analyze or try to analyze theodicies as striking failures to think along the lines of which Hannah Arendt talks about the failure to think as a dimension of what she calls the banality of evil. So how much do I have time? 5 minutes?
6-7 minutes.
All right.
You can use the table mic if that's really if that annoys you.
No, I'm fine with that. If you're fine. Sorry about the noise. The notification causes. Then, on the basis of this Kantian reading of the book of Job, we might distinguish between different ways of recognizing or failing to recognize or acknowledge suffering, or the suffering individual, or his experience of suffering, or the sincerity of that experience, or its communication and expression, and so on. So this would be different ways of failing to acknowledge the reality of suffering or the reality of evil. In addition, I would actually add a kind of a meta level failure to a typical failure to acknowledge that we can never sort of fully acknowledge the other suffering anyway, and that would be in a way failure to acknowledge that there are certain limits to our ability to acknowledge others in general. But let me add a few comments on how the philosophical discussion after Kant, especially the 20th century, then moves on. I'm not going to go into any details about any particular thinker here. I just want to note that there are interesting varieties of what we may call Kantian or post-Kantian anti-theodicism in very different philosophical traditions. So it seems to me that, that there is, first of all, something we may call I'm not sure if we can talk about tradition, but a kind of orientation or approach that we may call Jewish post-Holocaust ethical responses to suffering and evil. And I would have in mind thinkers such as Hans Jonas, for instance, or Emanuel Levinas, or Vladimir Yankovic, Richard Bernstein as well. Then there is the Wittgensteinian tradition, exemplified by these people listed here. Phillips, one of the most prominent ones among them. But then also, interestingly, there's something we may call pragmatist anti-theodicism. I've been working quite a bit on William James, and I would be willing to argue that there is a certain kind of anti-theodicism that frames his pragmatism in general, and in a way gives a certain kind of seriousness to the way in which he develops the pragmatist philosophical approach. If I had more time, I would also go into neo-pragmatism and the debate between Richard Rorty and James Cohen on reading Orwell's 1984, which is the book that deals with this issue. I'm not going to go into that. In their very different ways, all these different approaches of anti-theodicist thinking can, I think, be seen as presenting an essentially moral argument against theodicists. An argument that is based on the idea that theodicists fail to adequately recognize or acknowledge, especially the meaninglessness of suffering, and typically as a result of that, treats suffering human beings as mere means to some alleged overall good. Thus, in a way, subordinating the suffering individual's perspective to some totalizing framework or overall perspective. In a way, subordinating the human perspective to an imagined divine perspective. Of course, the way in which these different anti-theodicist views are developed and argued for by these various thinkers are very different. But I think they do share this basically moral approach to anti-theodicism. Then why am I saying they are Kantian? Well, I think they are Kantian for the special reason that they argue for anti-theodicism as what we might call a condition for the possibility of the moral perspective or moral seriousness itself. And I think that kind of an argument can be, in a way, be found implicitly in these different approaches. But as I said, I won't be going into any of these any of the details regarding this different views. This would, of course, require like developing and thoroughly articulating and defending the idea that anti-theodicism as a response to evil and suffering is something that the very possibility of occupying moral perspective presupposes. This is an extremely strong claim, and it would have to be argued in a much more thorough manner. And what I would suggest is that we also need fictional literature in order to appreciate this point, and therefore this. I'm just going to final, because I already have. I've been working on this topic recently in my own writings, but also more recently in some of the joint work I've done with Sami Pihlström, who's a literary scholar, professor of literature, and in the new book that is now coming out soon, Kantian anti-theodicism, philosophical literary varieties, we're trying to make the point that we also need fictional literature in order to understand this way in which anti-theodicism can be seen as a presupposition for the moral point of view and its possibility. But this concludes.
You can do a conclusion if you want.
No, I mean this is no. There is no conclusion.
All right, thank you.
Well, thank you, Sami, for a terrific presentation, and very rich and full, and reflects a lot of deep thought and research, and so I'm glad to hear your perspective and also glad to respond. In terms of what I presented, talking about kind of a theological context to make sense of ethics, I would say that when it comes to secular ethics or Kantian ethics, there still is a problem that needs to be addressed, and that would be the metaphysical. You see, I think that secular ethical systems, Kantianism and so forth, although Kant was himself a theist, he basically argued that you don't need God to justify this stance. But I think the problem is that when it comes to actually taking Kant's position, which assumes rationality, which assumes free will, which assumes the intrinsic dignity of human beings, you see, that is fundamentally rooted in a theistic worldview. And when we can talk about ethics and making ethical decisions and so forth, sure, we can all agree that there are some fundamental moral truths that we can agree on and so forth, but what is more fundamental, the metaphysical, is the image of God, that we have the capacity to reason, that we have intrinsic dignity and so forth. Where did that dignity come from in a valueless universe? It seems that theism offers us that better context for it. Now, I know that there is a difference in the literature when it comes to evil on theodicy versus defense. And I don't know if you wanted to offer some sort of a distinction there. Theodicy is a much stronger proposition than merely defense, saying that we can show that there is no incompatibility between belief in God and the existence of evil. Even if we don't know what those reasons are, that doesn't show that these are incompatible. But I'd also say, contrary to Kant, is that if God has spoken and acted in the world, then there is objective meaning when it comes to a divine perspective on suffering. Kant, rules that out when it seems to conflict with his system. But when he says we can't have knowledge of these things, well, notice this remarkable, it sounds like a divine-like stance, that he is making this assertion as though he is the authority on the matter. He is speaking with this kind of divine authority that we can't have knowledge. Well, what justifies that stance? I would say that we can, if there is a God who has revealed himself and makes known his reasons and steps into this world and suffers with us, then we have something more of a context to help empathize, to show that there is a God who has not forgotten those who are suffering. That we don't have to trivialize a person's suffering, but we can actually say, rather than appealing to some sort of an abstract system, we can talk about a God who actually enters in, not as some abstraction, but a God who actually steps into our world, who suffers with us, who dies a shameful and naked death on a cross to identify with the human condition, to say that that I have not forgotten about you. And I think that we often find that when we are in the midst of suffering, just like Job's friends who sat with him for 7 days without saying a word, I think that was when they were their wisest, when they were silent, when they were present, when they were with the one who suffered without having to say a word. And I think in the same way, God shows up at the end of the book of Job, not giving some answers, but he just is there, reminding Job that he is present, that Job has not been forgotten. And so when it comes to the theoretical, I think that we lose a lot when we talk about the framework that theism offers us, and that the Christian faith in particular offers us. Because in this framework we have an accounting not just for being able to know certain truths, we're all made in the image of God, even if we're atheists, and we can know moral right from wrong and we can make ethical decisions, but I would say that that doesn't go far enough to the metaphysical level, where we actually have a grounding for human dignity and worth, rationality, free will, and so forth. These are not unimportant considerations. So rather than saying, oh, let's forget all of that and let's just go right to dealing with suffering right now, well, I think that neglects the nature of who we are as human persons. If you're a naturalist, you don't have the groundwork to actually support the kind of things that you take for granted about human beings, their dignity, their rights, and so forth. That is better anchored in a theistic worldview. And so those are a few reflections that I have on your talk. And so I'd be curious to hear your responses to me and also your comments to these things. So thank you very much.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Paul.
I would also like to first briefly respond to your presentation, and then, I mean, these are of course all related, but let me say something. Anyway, if I sort of started to discuss your paper in detail, I would, I suppose, start to reflect on the way in which you draw the distinction between naturalism and theism, or naturalism and non-naturalism, because it seems to me that you are treating these as really polarized opposites in such a way that you're offering a relatively strong and sharp view of naturalism as something that is really a strongly reductive position with no sort of intermediaries in between. I mean, I would probably want to ask you to, or challenge you somehow to respond to those versions of naturalism that say they are non-reductive, or there are all kinds of suggestions as to how to develop an emergent naturalism, for instance, or it doesn't really, or at least seeks to maintain moral value, human dignity, all kinds of, in a way, soft things that hard scientific naturalism doesn't really find any room for in the natural world. So I would refer to those versions of naturalism that are not, strictly speaking, materialist in the reductive sense, nor do they have to be determinist. But of course, you did cite some interesting contributions to this discussion, including Jae-Kwon Kim, for instance, who has argued quite persuasively that it's difficult to maintain such a middle ground position in the naturalism discussion. But that's a huge debate, of course, in metaphysics and philosophy of mind and everywhere. So, but I think the general point would be that the dichotomy between naturalism with no cosmic purposes whatsoever, no human dignity, no value, no ethics, nothing whatsoever, and theism, on the other hand, with cosmic purposes and values based on those cosmic purposes and so on. I would find that way too sharp, because there are all kinds of intermediary, mildly naturalistic positions. There is also something called religious naturalism, of course, as you very well know. Right. So that's one issue. But then another issue would be which has more to do with the Kantian perspective. Then, when you say that there is the fundamental question about metaphysics and whether the, for instance, the ethical ideas in Kant must be rooted in a theistic worldview or some other metaphysics, then perhaps we should look at the Kantian point in such a way that he's suggesting that metaphysics is not the fundamental ground of everything. It's the other way around. It's in the critique of reason. It's epistemology rather than metaphysics that is the sort of starting point. The critique of reason is where we should begin from, and only then arrive at whatever metaphysics we might be able to commit ourselves to. And according to Kant, it was precisely the failure of his both rationalist and empiricist predecessors in the history of philosophy to appreciate this point that led them to either dogmatic metaphysical systems or to a skeptical rejection of any knowledge about reality, as in the case of Hume. So I'm certainly not at all denying that, for instance, a Christian framework or worldview or some other metaphysics of cosmic purpose is highly relevant to human beings' attempts to live with suffering and to find meaning in their lives. I'm not saying that such attempts to find meaningfulness in life are misguided or anything like that, and they need not be misguided even if they are based on some metaphysical or theological approach, not at all. But I'm just denying that such a metaphysical starting point would be the fundamental one. I think the fundamental issue concerns the response to suffering, and especially suffering that is experienced as meaningless. I didn't emphasize the theodicy versus defense distinction here. I didn't really have time for that. I think in some almost trivial sense, defense simply means that there is no incompatibility that's fine. I mean, you can certainly be a believer and take people serious. I'm not denying that.
Yeah.
But the very attempt to offer a difference already plays the game of the theodicism, and that's what I'm suggesting we should do.
Okay.
You can respond right away if you want.
Okay, sure. Yes, there are differing versions of naturalism, emergentism, and so forth, that certain properties supervene on subvening properties or subvenient properties, that, for example, mind or mental properties supervene on the brain when there is a sophisticated enough nervous system and brain to accommodate it and so forth. Now, on the one hand, I mean, there is criticism of emergentism that it simply is asserting rather than actually showing that this actually took place. Secondly, I wrote an article called, or contributed to a book called "The Naturalists Are Declaring the Glory of God," in which I just quote naturalists in my paper who actually lend amazing support to the existence of God, because they recognize, leading thinkers, Ned Block, a philosopher of mind, to John Searle or Jaegwon Kim and others, highly respected naturalists, who say that given naturalism, we just don't have the resources to come up with how consciousness could emerge from non-conscious matter, pursuing the truth, being rational beings could come from non-rational processes and so forth. So what I'm doing in some ways is, even if you allow for emergentism, and I'm not saying that this is at all incompatible with theism, it could very well be compatible with belief in God, who allows these natural properties to develop and for emergent properties to come about. So there's no conflict here at all. But if you've got God, then you do have, it's not just guesswork, it's actually guaranteed work, that God facilitates this. But furthermore, what I'm trying to do is say, even if you allow for emergentism, if you still go back to your raw material, what would lead us to expect rationality or consciousness or value or beauty or free will and so forth to emerge given mindless, non-conscious, unguided, materialistic, non-rational processes? It seems that the equipment isn't there to bring us to the outcome, whereas if theism is the case, you've got the material from the outset, and so you can, in a sense, bypass the whole supervenient, subvenient, emergent properties discussion by saying, at the very beginning, you just don't have that. In theism, you can expect this kind of an outcome of conscious beings, rational beings, and so forth. With naturalism, there is absolutely a shock, a surprise that this sort of an outcome could happen, and many naturalists register that shock. For example, one philosopher of mind who writes, he's an atheist, who talks about how we know how gravity could cause the formation of planets and so forth. He says, but we have absolutely no idea. This, by the way, this is Colin McGinn. He says, we have no idea how solid, how lumpy gray matter could produce vivid, inner, subjective, technicolor experience. We just don't have any clue how that could happen, how you can move from non-conscious matter to thinking matter. So again, these are the sorts of things that baffle the naturalist. But again, they don't baffle the theist. There is indeed a legitimate expectation for these kinds of outcomes, given the very upfront metaphysical basis. So anyway, and I'm probably taking more time than I should, but even if we go to Kant and we talk about beginning with epistemology, that is knowledge itself, the study of knowledge and so forth, rather than metaphysics, what is really real, we still have to note this. Isn't it interesting that even in the process of coming to know something, we are trusting our rational faculties not to be misleading us. We are trusting that they are not systematically deceiving us, that they can lead us into truth and so forth, that they can lead us to discover what is really real. But that sounds suspiciously theistic, that we are actually borrowing from a worldview of theism in which we've been made in the image of a rational God, who has created us with the capacity to think and to seek after truth. You see, one naturalist, Patricia Churchland, and her husband Paul, they say that there is no such thing as as really the truth. The pursuing of truth in the whole scheme of things. Basically, we can have all sorts of, the pursuit of truth is basically taking a backseat to the 4 F's, to fighting, fleeing, fighting, and reproducing. That's all there is to to our human makeup. And that truth is really not an issue, because we can have all sorts of false beliefs that may enhance survival and reproduction. We could have the false belief that human beings have dignity and worth, but it may be completely false, but it may enhance survival and reproduction. So truth isn't guaranteed at all, given naturalism. So those are some of the things that I would bring up.
I think we should move on to the discussion, because I would have numerous things to say. Of course, maybe in order to save some time for discussion. These are all important points. Extremely important.
So let's see if this works.
Just switch on. Keep working first.
Okay, it seems to be working now. Yes, okay. Excellent. So now I invite you to present questions, and I emphasize questions, no lectures, please. So end your comment with a question, and if you want, you can direct it to either one or both. So I have to stay here, so I'm sure. Yeah, there's a gentleman over there.
Okay, I have a question for Copan. You, in the beginning of your lecture, you described the theism versus naturalism, and in your scripture there was that God is good. So that was one part of your description of theism.
Right.
So isn't I was just thinking that where does it come from that in theism God should be good or has to be good?
Okay, why think that God has to be good? Well, in theism, we're talking about a being who is worship worthy, a being that ought to be worshipped, that is acknowledged to be anchoring reality, and therefore we have an obligation to that being to acknowledge and to live by what that being instructs us to do, the purposes that the being has for us. Now, if, let's say, somebody might say, well, what if an evil being created us? What if a being created us to maybe torture us, or hated humanity, and just created human beings to for a torture chamber or something like that? Well, that being would not be intrinsically good. That being would be evil, and that being would not be worthy of worship. That being ought not to be worshipped, in fact. So when we're talking about a God who is, worthy of worship, we're talking about a maximally great being. We're talking about a being that ought to be worshipped because that being is good, intrinsically good. So that's what is behind that. And again, we could talk about, I don't want to get sidetracked, but that's, to your point, there are a few other follow-up things that I could say, but I tend to ramble on, so I won't.
Did you have something on that, Sami?
Well, I don't think I have any new points to add on that. Of course, there is a tradition which when it comes to discussing the theodicity problem, this is a more general point. Some people, of course, suggest that one way of dealing with the problem would be to give up some of the traditional attributes of God, either goodness or omnipotence or omniscience or something, at least somehow adjust the picture of God that we have to the reality of evil. So that would be the broader issue. We might have to slightly at least adjust that picture in order to...
Right, people like Alan Plantinga have addressed people like J.L. Mackey who have brought that really up. Yeah.
And William James, whom I mentioned, in a way has a finite God.
Or process theism.
And in an entirely different tradition, Hans Jonas also has a finite God. Talks about like a self-contracting God,
Right.
and something along those lines.
Yeah.
So if you have questions, keep your hand up clearly so I can see it first.
Mr. Copa, one of your arguments against naturalism was that without God, morality is all just subjective, like matter of just taste, personal preferences. But with the existence of God, isn't it still totally subjective, but the person whose opinions it's based on is just a God instead of a human being? So how do you basically bypass subjectivity into creating objective morals just by creating a God?
Yeah. Well, we're not creating a God, hopefully, in our minds, but this God is real. But yes, no, we're talking about a being who is maximally great. We're talking about a being, as Anselm the theologian said, a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. And so we're talking about a being that would be intrinsically good and worthy of worship, and therefore the standard. This being could not be deficient in goodness. And so this is what we're talking about, that if we have some sort of, for example, a measure of, like Marilyn Adams' list of horrible things, the paradigmatic evils and so forth, well, if those are indeed genuine evils, then we have some sort of an idea, an intuition of the opposite, the standards of goodness that would be opposed to that. And we'd have to ask the question, where do those come from? What is the source of our vehemence against those kinds of practices and so forth? If they're simply subjective experiences, simply our own personal preferences, then how could we really condemn someone like a Hitler or Stalin? But we do know that torturing babies for fun is wrong, and all of those things that Marilyn Adams listed. And I think this points us in the direction of some kind of a standard. And so in the absence of some sort of a naturalistic grounding for it, which I don't see, I think we're pointed in a transcendent direction. In fact, many atheists themselves who want to hold on to a naturalistic moral realism still have to go to, and I think of Eric Wielenberg, for example, who's a philosopher and atheist, but yet he claims that there is some sort of a moral standard that already exists. He talks about these moral truths exist, and that eventually moral beings develop that kind of correspond to those moral truths that in a sense have been awaiting them. And so, but I would say what you're doing, first of all, is moving into a transcendent realm, the realm beyond nature. And then secondly, isn't it a cosmic coincidence that those moral facts that have already been waiting there somehow coincide with these beings that come billions of years, after the universe began, that somehow they have an obligation to pay attention to those moral facts? I think God makes those things a lot simpler. So anyway, a few thoughts there. Thank you.
Well, I guess here the secular ethical thinker would say that, there are more or less objective moral standards, but they are something that are human-made. There is no reason to suppose that somebody, like some transcendent God, made those standards or makes us obliged to meet them. I mean, that would of course be the Kantian point all over again, that we find the moral law within us rather than in any transcendent sphere. But this is obviously a large issue that we can't settle here.
There was a question over there. Yes.
Thank you both. I'd like to ask a question to Professor Sami. Talk about the moral values, it is independent of religion. I'd like to ask, in a non-theist worldview, why would we have the obligation to obey those existing moral values? Why should we obey them, or in opposition to disregard them?
If I get it right, you're asking why would we have an obligation to obey any moral values or standards if they are not based on some transcendent divine? If they are just based on human action or human thought.
Well, we could think of the idea of there being things like moral values or moral standards or obligations. That we could simply think of them as being part of the human world in a way. That these are ways in which we human beings organize or approach the world and our lives, both our own and those of others. These are parts of the conceptual system through which we human beings view the world, and we have started to use moral language. We have started to approach reality in these terms, conceptualizing our lives and the various life situations we find ourselves in along those lines and in these ways. And there is no reason to suppose that anything beyond humanity is needed. Then, of course, somebody who believes in a divine transcendent grounding of all this would find this hopelessly insufficient, because then it wouldn't give the absolute reason or absolute ground for our being obliged to meet those moral standards. But then I guess the naturalist response would be that there is no need for any such non-human or superhuman standard. Morality is a human matter. It's a human issue thoroughly, and there is nothing transcendent about it at all. And now here I'm hoping to avoid any sort of polemical dialogue between naturalism or secular ethics and theism, because I'm not defending either theism or atheism. That's not part of my agenda at all. So I'm just suggesting that moral philosophy or ethics is in a way more fundamental than metaphysics, in the sense that no matter what metaphysical views we have about God's existence or anything at all, we have to deal with the question of how to respond to evil and suffering, and that would be the prior question. I'm not here committed to the Kantian approach in any detail, but this would come close to the Kantian idea that in the end it's practical reason that is prior to theoretical reason, and it's only through practical reason, that is ethics, that Kant arrives at his theistic worldview, let me put it that way. It's only on ethical grounds that Kant finds it reasonable and necessary to postulate God's existence, for instance. But of course, again, if you start from a theistic metaphysics, then that's insufficient, and I can see the point. But I'm not sure if our sort of understanding of evil and suffering and our understanding the ways in which we ought to respond to them is enhanced if we're stuck to this sort of polemical dialogue between different worldviews. I don't think that's really a promising way to go.
Yeah, and if I may jump in here too, thank you. I think even as we look at the matter of Kant, and his starting points, remember that Kant does come from a tradition heavily shaped by a biblical worldview in which humans have been made in the image of God, and so that's why he refers to human beings as having value rather than cost. That human beings are not a means, but they are an end in and of themselves. And he talks about the community of ends and so forth, in which we all participate. So the question then becomes, well, what is that community of ends grounded on? How do they get their value? I think we're still being brought back to a metaphysical grounding that is required to justify asserting their value. And what about the notion of morality is just basically a human thing? It's kind of interesting. Michael Ruse and E.O. Wilson, a philosopher and a biologist, both atheists, they talk about how if we had we developed from these savanna-dwelling primates that buried their dead, that disposed of their feces, that didn't cannibalize one another. But what if we developed like termites? What if we developed a termite ethic in which we would cannibalize our dead, where we would eat our feces, where we would, rather than dwelling out in the savannah, we would dwell in darkness and so forth. And we would say, those, dwelling in darkness is great. I mean, maybe the Finns do like dwelling in darkness. I don't know. But eating our waste or cannibalizing our children, they're saying that, well, we could have developed in completely different ways. Here we are talking about certain moral standards, but if these had been developed through, just sheer naturalistic, unguided, biological evolution without any divine guidance, then why think that this is, the only way of thinking morally? We could have, ended up thinking oppositely. In fact, one scholar who's an anthropologist, another who's a biologist, they wrote a book, Thornhill and Palmer wrote a book called A Natural History of Rape, in which they talk about how rape can actually, from their studies, their research, rape can actually be justified, naturalistically, that there's a scientific basis for rape. When a man can't find a female to mate with, then he forces himself upon a female, so because of that subconscious drive to survive and reproduce. Now, of course, there will be protest. Feminists protested this book. They're upset. But notice what they'll have to do is appeal to a transcendent standard beyond what is merely natural, what merely enhances survival and reproduction and so forth, and appeal to a standard that goes beyond nature. And again, we're moving toward the transcendent rather than sticking with the natural. And so I would say that even when we begin with epistemology, we still are presupposing that our minds are trustworthy and reliable, and that will lead us to truth, rather than simply enhancing survival and reproduction. I think we're borrowing from a theistic worldview to justify trustworthy rationality. And again, if we're made in the image of a trustworthy, rational God, then that sort of a trust is warranted.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes and 3 questions, so we'll do as many as we can. So, Emil first.
To Mr. Copan, you talked a lot about the incarnation and the cross as providing, a divine meaning to our suffering, but Sami Pihlström brought up also Job, and then there's the traditional Old Testament idea of God punishing the evildoers, and there are different kind of also biblical explanations for suffering and evil, and how do you view this sort of diversity, and is it more than just different kind of human interpretations and explanations to deal with
suffering? It's more than just human what was that?
Interpretations and human explanations, to deal with suffering. Is this kind of just human comfort? We make up this kind of, we see some sort of divine plan in the cross, or we just say like Job, well, I don't know, God is the answer. So how do you kind of cross that line between just religious interpretations or comfort to kind of objective divine meaning in our suffering?
Well, I think that there is a God who speaks, a God who does communicate with human beings and does communicate with us in the course of human history. And there have been, developing stories and ways in which God has come into this world and spoken. And again, I would say yes, in the incarnation, God becoming human in Jesus Christ, and in the cross, we find that suffering is not some sort of a meaningless thing. It doesn't have to be at any rate. And that there is a God who enters into this world of suffering and pain. And I think that just even apart from the matter of, well, is that just your interpretation? As I said, I did 3 books on the historical Jesus, and that there is very good historical grounding for these sorts of things. So it's not simply a matter of, well, this is just kind of my interpretation, but there are a whole bunch of them out there. Well, if God has revealed himself in Jesus Christ, and God raised Jesus from the dead to remind us that death and suffering and evil are not the final word, but actually God's victory is the final word. This puts a whole new perspective on suffering. And the Apostle Paul, the first missionary to proclaim this good news, was confronted. He had been a persecutor of Christians, and he was arrested and stopped short. And he himself was willing to, he came to see suffering as something that was a way of identifying with a suffering Savior who cared enough to come into this world rather than just simply ignoring us. And so it gives to us a new courage, it gives to us a new boldness, it gives to us a reminder that suffering does not have to be gratuitous or meaningless, but it is part of the, again, the purposes of God in which we can see those things much more clearly.
Do you have something on that, Paul?
I would have had a comment on the previous
Oh, sorry.
But, I mean, just very briefly,
Just-
between the sort of reductively naturalistic and the transcendent views on morality, there would be just a human. I mean, you say that morality is a human matter. You're not saying that it's just a biological matter or anything like that. There is a whole lot in between.
I could forget.
Yeah.
Good clarification.
I think that's a good way to conclude. So I think we've enjoyed an excellent discussion, and I'm actually quite interested in the problem of evil now because of all this, and I haven't been that interested earlier. So I think we've done a good job. I would like you to join me in thanking the two presenters.